The sun blazed mercilessly over Miami's skyline as Victor Castellanos stood behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, surveying his empire. At 52, he commanded respect with just a glance. His salt and pepper hair, perfectly styled, his Italian suit immaculate despite the sweltering heat outside. The city sprawled beneath him like a chessboard where he moved every piece with calculated precision. "Mr. Castellanos, your 3 o'clock appointment is here." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, breaking the silence that had settled over the 42nd floor of the Castellanos Tower. "Send them in," Victor replied, without turning from the window. He watched the traffic below, each car a metaphor for the lives he influenced, all moving according to his design. Behind him, the office door opened with a soft whoosh, and footsteps approached across the marble floor. Victor caught the reflection of his visitor in the window's glass, but more importantly, he saw the familiar silhouette of Marcus Rivera standing by the entrance, arms crossed, alert as always. Marcus had been his head of security for 3 years now, and Victor couldn't imagine conducting business without him. At 35, Marcus possessed an understated strength that commanded respect without demanding attention. His dark eyes constantly scanned every room, every face, every potential threat. Today, like every day, he wore a perfectly tailored black suit that concealed the weapon Victor knew rested against his ribs. "The Henderson deal is finalized," Victor announced to his guest, finally turning from the window. "Your concerns about the zoning permits were unfounded. When you have the right connections, obstacles become stepping stones." The real estate developer across from him nodded nervously, clearly intimidated by Victor's reputation. In Miami's business circles, Victor Castellanos was known as the man who never lost. Not a deal, not a negotiation, not even a parking space. His empire encompassed luxury hotels, beachfront developments, and half the restaurants that made South Beach famous. As the meeting concluded and the visitor departed, Victor noticed Marcus step closer to his desk. There was something different in his posture today, a tension that Victor's trained eye immediately detected. "Everything secure?" Victor asked, loosening his tie slightly. It was a ritual question asked at the end of every business day. "Always," Marcus replied, but his voice carried an undertone Victor had never heard before. "Though I wanted to discuss something with you. Personal security protocols." Victor raised an eyebrow. In 3 years, Marcus had never requested a private discussion about anything personal. Their relationship was built on professional respect and an unspoken understanding that boundaries were never crossed. "What's on your mind?" Victor settled into his leather chair, studying Marcus's face for clues. The younger man's jaw was tighter than usual, and he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "It's about tomorrow's event at South Beach, the charity gala." Marcus moved closer to the desk, his hands clasped behind his back in military fashion, a habit from his years in the Marines. "I've identified some potential vulnerabilities in the setup." Victor leaned back, intrigued. Marcus was thorough, but never paranoid. If he was concerned, there was reason to be. "What kind of vulnerabilities?" "The venue is too open. Too many access points. Too many people who haven't been properly vetted." Marcus's voice grew more intense with each word. "I think you should consider canceling." "Canceling?" Victor laughed, but it wasn't entirely amused. "Marcus, this gala raises $2 million for children's hospitals. Half of Miami's power players will be there. I can't just cancel because you're feeling jumpy." Something flashed across Marcus's eyes. Frustration, perhaps, or something deeper. "It's not about being jumpy, Victor. It's about..." He stopped himself, and Victor caught the slip immediately. "Victor?" The use of his first name hung in the air between them like a confession. In 3 years, Marcus had never called him anything but Mr. Castellanos, or Sir. Marcus's face flushed slightly, a crack in his usually impenetrable composure. "I meant Mr. Castellanos. I apologize for the informality." But Victor's mind was already racing. He had built his empire by reading people, by catching the smallest details that others missed. And right now, every instinct screamed that something fundamental had shifted in the room. Marcus. He stood slowly, his voice dropping to the tone he used in his most critical negotiations. "In 3 years, you've never once questioned my judgment on an event. You've never suggested canceling anything, and you've certainly never called me by my first name." He walked around the desk, closing the distance between them. "So I'll ask you again, what's really on your mind?" Marcus stood perfectly still, but Victor could see the internal battle playing out across his features. His security chief's breathing had changed, becoming slightly shallower. His hands, usually steady as granite, trembled almost imperceptibly. "The gala is important to you," Marcus said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Your safety is important to me. That's all." "That's all?" Victor studied his face intently. "Marcus, I've seen you stare down armed men without blinking. I've watched you clear rooms like a professional soldier, but right now, you look like you're about to face a firing squad." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Outside, Miami's evening traffic hummed 42 floors below, but inside the office, the only sound was the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the faint tick of Victor's antique watch. Marcus finally met his eyes directly, and Victor saw something there that made his chest tighten inexplicably. It wasn't fear. Marcus didn't know how to be afraid. It wasn't anger. Marcus's anger was always cold and controlled. It was something Victor had never seen in those dark eyes before. It was longing. "The gala is tomorrow night," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And after that, everything changes." Victor felt something shift in his perfectly ordered world, like the first tremor before an earthquake. "What do you mean?" "Everything changes." Marcus looked away, his jaw working as if he were swallowing words that desperately wanted to be spoken. "I mean that some secrets are too heavy to carry forever, Mr. Castellanos, and tomorrow night on that beach, with all those people watching..." He paused, meeting Victor's eyes again. "Some secrets demand to be told." The words hit Victor like a physical blow. In his world of calculated moves and predictable outcomes, Marcus Rivera had just introduced an element of chaos that made his hands shake slightly against his sides. "What secret, Marcus?" But Marcus was already walking toward the door, his composure restored, but somehow more fragile than before. "I'll have the car ready at 7 tomorrow evening, sir. The event starts at 8. As the door closed behind him, Victor remained standing in his empty office, staring at the space where Marcus had been. For the first time in decades, Victor Castellanos, the man who controlled everything, felt completely out of control. And deep in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his early 20s began to unfurl like a dangerous flower. Tomorrow, night couldn't come fast enough. The morning sun painted Miami in shades of gold and pink as Victor stood on his penthouse balcony, coffee growing cold in his hands. He hadn't slept, hadn't even tried. Marcus's words echoed in his mind like a song he couldn't forget. Some secrets demand to be told. 42 floors below, the city was already alive with traffic and ambition, but Victor felt disconnected from it all. His empire of steel and glass suddenly seemed fragile, built on assumptions he'd never questioned until now. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Security detail confirmed for tonight, all protocols in place." Professional, distant, nothing like the man who had called him Victor with such unexpected intimacy just 18 hours ago. Victor set down his coffee and walked back into his bedroom, where 3 different tuxedos hung waiting for his selection. The charity gala was Miami's social event of the year, and his appearance mattered, not just for his reputation, but for the $2 million it would raise. Children's lives literally depended on this evening going perfectly, so why did he feel like he was preparing for his own execution? His phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. "Castellanos. Victor, darling, please tell me you're wearing the Armani tonight." Isabella Moreau's voice carried that familiar mix of affection and manipulation that had characterized their on-and-off relationship for the past 2 years. As Miami's premier gallery owner, she understood the importance of appearances. "I haven't decided yet," Victor replied, though his eyes had already settled on the classic black tuxedo. "The photographers will be everywhere. CNN, Vanity Fair, even some European outlets. You need to look." She paused, and he could almost hear her choosing her words carefully. Powerful, untouchable, untouchable. The word hit him strangely. Was that really how people saw him? More importantly, was that how Marcus saw him? "Victor, are you there?" "Yes, sorry. Business on my mind." "Well, push it aside for tonight. This gala is about celebrating your generosity, not your corporate deals." Isabella's voice softened. "I'm proud of what you're doing for those children." After hanging up, Victor found himself thinking about children, about the childhood he'd never had, growing up poor in Little Havana, while his mother worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. Every dollar of his fortune was built on the promise that he'd never be powerless again. But last night, standing in his office with Marcus, he'd felt something he hadn't experienced since those early days: vulnerability. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Victor glanced at his watch, 9:30 a.m. His housekeeper didn't come until noon, and he wasn't expecting anyone. Through the security monitor, he saw Marcus standing in the hallway, looking even more composed than usual. Victor buzzed him up, his pulse quickening for reasons he couldn't name. "Good morning, Mr. Castellanos." Marcus stepped into the penthouse, his usual black suit replaced by casual jeans and a white button-down shirt. Somehow, he looked even more imposing without the formal attire. "This is unexpected," Victor said, closing the door behind him. "Is there a problem with tonight's security?" "No problem." Marcus moved to the living room windows, looking out at the ocean in the distance. "I wanted to talk to you. Away from the office. Away from..." He gestured vaguely at the corporate atmosphere that usually surrounded them. Victor joined him by the windows, maintaining careful distance. "Talk about what?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped behind, his back in that familiar military stance. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, more personal. "Do you remember when you hired me?" The question caught Victor off guard. "Of course. You'd just left private military contracting, highest recommendations I'd ever seen." "Do you remember what you said to me during the interview?" Victor thought back 3 years. He'd interviewed dozens of candidates for the position, but Marcus had stood out immediately, not just for his credentials, but for something indefinable in his presence. "I said I needed someone I could trust completely, someone who would put my safety above everything else, including their own life. And I said I would." Marcus turned to face him, and Victor was struck again by the intensity in those dark eyes. "I meant it. I still mean it." "I know you do. Your dedication has been..." Victor searched for the right word. "Exceptional. Dedication." Marcus repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "Is that what you call it?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning Victor wasn't sure he was ready to understand. "What else would I call it?" Marcus stepped closer, close enough that Victor could smell his cologne, something subtle and masculine that he'd unconsciously associated with safety for 3 years. "Victor." Again, that use of his first name, spoken like a secret. "Do you..." Really think I've spent 3 years watching over you, learning every expression on your face, memorizing your habits, studying your moods, just out of professional dedication? Victor's breath caught. Marcus, do you think I requested to personally drive you to events because it was more secure? Do you think I insisted on checking your penthouse every night because I was worried about intruders? Marcus's voice grew more intense with each word. Do you think I turned down 3 job offers from other clients because I was satisfied with my salary? The room seemed to spin around Victor. 3 years of interaction suddenly recontextualized themselves in his mind. Marcus's lingering glances, his protective instincts that went beyond professional duty, the way he seemed to anticipate Victor's needs before Victor himself recognized them. Why are you telling me this now? Victor's voice came out rougher than intended, because tonight at that gala, Isabella Moreau is going to announce your engagement. The words hit Victor like a physical blow. What? She's been planning it for weeks. The ring is already in her purse. She's coordinated with the event photographer to capture the moment. Marcus's jaw tightened. She's going to propose to you in front of 200 people, knowing you're too much of a gentleman to embarrass her publicly. Victor sank into a nearby chair, his mind reeling. Isabella had been pushing for a more serious commitment, but marriage, a public proposal. How do you know this? Because I'm good at my job, because I investigate threats to your well-being. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. And because I've been investigating ways to stop it for 2 weeks. The admission hung in, the air between them, raw and dangerous. Marcus, what are you saying? I'm saying that in 6 hours, the woman you've been casually dating is going to trap you in an engagement you don't want, in front of cameras that will broadcast it across Miami's social media. Marcus moved closer, his hands trembling slightly. And I'm saying that I can't stand by and watch it happen. So what do you suggest? Victor's voice was barely a whisper. Marcus knelt in front of his chair, bringing them to eye level. I suggest we give those cameras something else to focus on. Victor stared into Marcus's eyes, seeing 3 years of suppressed emotion finally breaking free. And what would that be? The truth. Marcus reached out slowly, giving Victor time to pull away, and placed his hand over Victor's. The truth about why I really took this job. The truth about why I've never let anyone else get close enough to hurt you. The truth about why I wake up every morning grateful that keeping you safe is my only responsibility. Victor looked down at their joined hands, his pale and soft from years behind a desk, Marcus's darker and calloused from years of training and vigilance. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, and the most terrifying. The truth could destroy everything I've built, Victor said quietly. Or it could save you from a life you never wanted. Marcus's thumb traced across Victor's knuckles. The question is, are you brave enough to find out which? Outside, Miami hummed with its usual energy, unaware that on the 42nd floor of the Castellanos Tower's residential section, 2 men were contemplating a decision that would change everything. Victor lifted his free hand and touched Marcus's face, feeling the slight stubble, the warmth of skin he'd wondered about for longer than he cared to admit. If we do this, he whispered, there's no going back. There's no going back anyway, Marcus replied. Not after tonight, not after Isabella's proposal, not after 3 years of pretending this doesn't exist. Victor closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his carefully constructed life pressing down on him. When he opened them again, Marcus was still there, still real, still waiting. What happens at the gala? Victor asked. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile Victor had seen from him in 3 years. We give Miami something to really talk about. The Fontainebleau Hotel's ballroom glittered like a jewel against the darkening Miami sky. Victor stood, in the VIP preparation area, adjusting his bow tie for the third time, while his reflection stared back from the full-length mirror. The Armani tuxedo Isabella had recommended fit perfectly, but he felt like he was wearing a costume for a role he no longer wanted to play. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, South Beach stretched out below, palm trees swaying in the evening, breeze, the ocean catching the last rays of sunset like scattered diamonds. In 2 hours, this same beach would witness either his salvation or his destruction. Mr. Castellanos, a young woman with a clipboard, approached nervously. "We're ready for your sound check." Victor nodded, following her toward the main ballroom, where the charity gala's stage awaited. 200 of Miami's most influential people would soon fill these tables, their phones ready to capture every moment for social media immortality. As he tested the microphone, Victor's eyes found Marcus stationed near the ballroom's main entrance. Even from a distance, he could see the tension in his security chief's posture, shoulders slightly raised, jaw set, eyes constantly scanning. The growing crowd of early arrivals. They hadn't spoken since the morning's revelation in his penthouse. Marcus had left with a simple, "I'll see you tonight," but those words carried the weight of everything they'd admitted to each other. "Victor, darling," he turned to see Isabella approaching, radiant in a silver gown that perfectly complemented her blonde hair. She moved with the confidence of a woman who owned every room she entered, and tonight she clearly intended to own this one completely. "You look magnificent," she said, reaching up to adjust his tie with practiced intimacy. "The photographers are already asking for pre-event shots." "Isabella, we should talk later, darling. Right now, I need you to charm the Henderson family. They're considering a major donation, but they're still on the fence." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "I may have hinted that tonight would be special. They're very invested in seeing how the evening unfolds." Victor's stomach dropped. Marcus had been right. This wasn't just a proposal Isabella was planning. She'd laid groundwork, built expectations, created a public narrative that would be impossible to escape once set in motion. Isabella, Victor Castellanos. They were interrupted by Senator Patricia Williams, whose husband's construction company had built half of Victor's hotel properties. The next 30 minutes blurred into a parade of handshakes, air kisses, and small talk that felt increasingly surreal. Through it all, Victor remained aware of Marcus's presence, a constant, steady force in his peripheral vision. Twice their eyes met across the crowded room, and each time Victor felt that same electric current that had sparked in his office and intensified in his penthouse. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats," the event coordinator announced. "We'll begin with cocktails on the terrace, followed by dinner and our special program." As guests began moving toward the oceanfront terrace, Isabella slipped her arm through Victor's. "Shall we make our entrance?" Victor glanced toward Marcus, who was speaking quietly into his radio, coordinating the security detail that would follow them outside. For a moment their eyes met again, and Marcus gave an almost imperceptible nod. It was time. The terrace overlooked South Beach's famous shoreline, where the waves caught the glow of the hotel's lighting in endless, hypnotic patterns. Round tables dotted the space, each adorned with white orchids and flickering candles. A small stage had been erected at the far end, facing both the seated guests and the beach beyond. Victor and Isabella were seated at the head table, surrounded by Miami's power elite. The mayor, several city council members, prominent business owners, and major philanthropists. Conversations flowed around him about real estate developments, upcoming elections, and vacation plans, but Victor felt disconnected from it all. His attention kept drifting to Marcus, who had positioned himself strategically near the terrace's edge, where he could observe both the guests and the beach approach. The security chief looked calm and professional, but Victor could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. The Children's Hospital Edition will serve over 5,000 patients annually, Isabella was explaining to the table, her hand resting possessively on Victor's arm. "Victor's generosity is truly changing lives." Murmurs of approval rippled around the table, and Victor managed to smile appropriately while his mind raced through possible scenarios for the evening ahead. "And speaking of changing lives," Isabella continued, her voice taking on a slightly different tone, "I think tonight might be full of wonderful surprises." Mrs. Henderson leaned forward eagerly. "Oh, I do love surprises at charity events. They make the cause feel so much more personal." Isabella's smile turned secretive. "I think you'll find tonight very memorable indeed." Victor's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced down discreetly. "Ready when you are. M." His finger hovered over the keyboard. Everything he'd built, every relationship he'd cultivated, every carefully constructed piece of his public persona, it could all change with his response. Another text from Marcus. "Isabella just excused herself. She's heading toward the event coordinator's station." Victor looked up to see that Isabella's seat was indeed empty. Through the crowd, he spotted her blonde hair near the small technical area where the evening's program was being managed. "If you'll excuse me," Victor said to the table, "I need to check on the presentation setup." He rose and made his way through the mingling guests, accepting congratulations and small talk, while his heart pounded steadily harder. Near the coordinator station, he could hear Isabella's voice after his speech about the hospital donation. "That's when the lighting should shift to spotlight our table. Make sure the photographer is ready. I want every angle captured." Victor stepped into the shadows behind a decorative palm where he could observe without being seen. Isabella was indeed holding a small jewelry box, gesturing expressively as she outlined her plan to the increasingly uncomfortable-looking event coordinator. "Ma'am, we usually coordinate these kinds of personal moments in advance with all parties involved," the coordinator said delicately. "Oh, don't worry about Victor. He loves surprises." Isabella's laugh sounded forced. "Besides, with all these photographers and social media coverage, it will be wonderful publicity for the charity. Who doesn't love a romantic story?" Victor felt a hand touch his elbow gently. He turned to find Marcus beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Last chance to change your mind," Marcus murmured so quietly only Victor could hear. Victor looked out at the terrace full of Miami's elite, then back at Isabella coordinating her ambush proposal, then finally into Marcus's eyes. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he whispered back. Marcus's face transformed with something between relief and determination. "Then let's give them a show they'll never forget." As if summoned by their conversation, Isabella turned and spotted Victor through the palm fronds. Her smile brightened immediately. "There you are! I was just making sure everything's perfect." "For your speech." She hurried over, slipping her arm through his again. "The coordinator says they're ready whenever you are." Victor nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. "Then I suppose it's time." As they walked toward the stage together, Victor was acutely aware of Marcus falling into step behind them, close enough to fulfill his security duties, close enough to hear every word that was about to be spoken, close enough to change everything with a single action. The evening breeze carried the salt scent of the ocean and the distant sound of waves against the shore. In 15 minutes, Victor Castellanos would step onto that stage to address Miami's most powerful people. What happened next would depend entirely on which version of courage proved stronger: the courage to maintain his carefully constructed life, or the courage to embrace the truth that had been building between them for 3 years. Behind them, the hotel's photographer checked his camera settings one final time, unknowingly preparing to document the moment that would reshape Miami's social landscape forever. The applause began before Victor even reached the microphone, building to a crescendo that echoed across South Beach. 200 faces looked up at him expectantly, faces he'd known for years, people who'd helped build his empire and shared in his success. The ocean stretched endlessly behind them, waves, catching the stage lights like scattered stars. "Thank you," Victor said, his voice carrying clearly across the terrace. The crowd settled into attentive silence, smartphones already recording, the photographer positioning himself for the perfect shot. From the stage, Victor could see everything. Isabella at the head table, her hand resting on what he now knew was an engagement ring. Marcus stationed at the terrace's edge, alert but ready, the expectant faces of Miami's elite waiting for inspiration. 3 years ago, Victor began, deviating from the speech he'd prepared. "I hired a security consultant who changed my life in ways I never expected." A murmur of curiosity rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the typical charity gala opening they'd expected. Isabella frowned slightly, clearly trying to figure out how this connected to her planned surprise. "This consultant taught me that true security isn't about protecting what you have. It's about having the courage to protect what matters most." Victor's eyes found Marcus, who stood perfectly still, his face unreadable. "Tonight, as we celebrate our commitment to Miami's children, I want to talk about courage." The crowd leaned forward, sensing something significant in Victor's tone. Courage isn't just about facing external threats. Sometimes the greatest courage is required to face the truth about ourselves. Victor stepped closer to the microphone, his voice growing stronger. "For too long, I've hidden behind the protection of expectations, social expectations, business expectations, personal expectations that weren't really mine." He could see Isabella's confusion deepening, her hand moving instinctively toward the jewelry box in her purse. "The children we're supporting tonight deserve a world where they can grow up authentic, where they don't have to hide who they are to be accepted, where love is celebrated rather than concealed." Victor's heart was pounding, but his voice remained steady. "And if we're asking them to be brave, then we adults must lead by example." Senator Williams whispered something to her husband, who shrugged with obvious bewilderment. Victor took a deep breath, the salt air filling his lungs as he prepared to step off the cliff he'd been approaching all evening. "Marcus Rivera, would you join me up here?" The request hit the crowd like a physical wave. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones that had been recording casually snapped to full attention. Isabella's face went pale as understanding began to dawn. Marcus didn't hesitate. He crossed the terrace with measured steps, his professional composure intact, but something deeper flickering in his eyes. When he reached the stage, he stood beside Victor, facing the crowd with the same calm strength he brought to every situation. "For 3 years, Victor continued, his voice carrying across the now silent terrace, "Marcus has protected me from every conceivable threat. But the one thing he couldn't protect me from was the truth, that somewhere along the way, professional respect became personal admiration, admiration became friendship, and friendship became something I was too afraid to name." Isabella stood abruptly from her table, the jewelry box falling from her lap and clattering onto the terrace floor. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the stunned silence. "Victor, what are you doing?" she called out, her voice tight with shock and rising anger. Victor looked directly at her, his expression gentle but resolute. "I'm being honest, Isabella, perhaps for the first time in years." He turned back to the crowd, acutely aware of Marcus's presence beside him. Solid, unwavering, real. "I've spent decades building walls to protect myself from vulnerability, from judgment, from the possibility of being rejected for who I truly am." Victor's voice grew more passionate. "But love, real love, doesn't respect walls. It doesn't care about social conventions or business reputations or carefully constructed public images." The photographer's camera flashed repeatedly, capturing every moment for posterity. "Marcus Rivera is not just my security chief. He's not just the man who keeps me safe from physical threats." Victor turned to face Marcus directly, the crowd forgotten for a moment. He's the man who makes me want to be brave enough to stop hiding. Marcus's professional mask finally cracked, revealing 3 years of suppressed emotion in his eyes. Victor. Marcus's voice was barely audible through the microphone, but the single word carried everything: surprise, relief, love, and a question that needed answering. "I love you," Victor said simply, the words carrying across the terrace like a bell. "I love your strength, your integrity, your unwavering loyalty. I love the way you anticipate danger before I even sense it. I love that you've spent 3 years protecting my life, and now I want to spend the rest of mine protecting yours." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then Marcus stepped closer, close enough that their shoulders touched. Close enough that everyone could see the smile spreading across his face. "I love you too," Marcus said, his voice stronger now, carrying clearly through the sound system. "I've loved you since the first day you trusted me with your safety. I've loved you through every late night, every business trip, every moment. I stood guard while you slept." Spontaneous applause began from one table. Victor couldn't see who started it, but it spread like wildfire across the terrace. Some people clapped enthusiastically, others sat in stunned silence, but the overall response was overwhelming support. Isabella pushed through the crowd toward the stage, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. "This is ridiculous," she shouted over the applause. "Victor, think about what you're doing. Think about your reputation, your business relationships, your—" "Isabella." Victor's voice cut through her protest with quiet authority. "I'm thinking about my happiness. For the first time in decades, I'm choosing what I want instead of what's expected of me." She stared up at him, her carefully planned evening crumbling around her. "This is a mistake. You'll regret this." "The only thing I regret," Victor said gently, "is that it took me this long to find the courage." Isabella turned and stalked away, pushing through the crowd and disappearing into the hotel. A few guests followed her exit with their eyes, but most remained focused on the stage. Victor took Marcus's hand, their fingers intertwining naturally as camera flashes exploded around them. The simple gesture sent another wave of applause across the terrace. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor said, his voice lighter now, freed from the weight of deception. "Love is love. And tonight, we're celebrating not just our commitment to Miami's children, but our commitment to living authentically." He lifted their joined hands toward the sky, and the crowd erupted in cheers that seemed to echo off the ocean itself. As the applause continued, Marcus leaned close to Victor's ear. "So what happens now?" Victor looked out at the crowd, some faces showing surprise, others showing joy, a few showing disapproval, but all showing engagement with his truth. "Now," Victor said, squeezing Marcus's hand, "we find out who our real friends are." The charity gala continued for another 2 hours, but it had been transformed into something entirely different. A celebration not just of generosity toward children in need, but of courage, authenticity, and love in its most unexpected forms. By the time the last guest departed, Victor and Marcus stood alone on the terrace, the ocean breeze cooling the air around them. The evening had raised $3.2 million for the Children's Hospital, the most successful charity gala in the event's history. "No regrets?" Marcus asked. His security detail finally relaxed as the last car pulled away from the hotel. Victor looked out at the waves washing endlessly against South Beach, then back at the man who had changed his life simply by being brave enough to love him. "None," Victor said. "Only gratitude." As they walked back into the hotel together, hand in hand, neither man looked back at the stage where Miami's social landscape had been forever changed. The ocean continued its eternal rhythm against the shore, witness to another story of courage conquering fear, love conquering convention, and two people choosing truth over safety. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight had proven they were ready to face them together. 6 months after the charity gala that became Miami's most talked-about social event, Victor stood in his penthouse office, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and pink. The view hadn't changed, but everything else had. The Castellanos Tower still dominated the skyline. His business empire remained intact, stronger than ever, actually. But the man who surveyed it all bore little resemblance to the carefully controlled magnate who had hidden behind walls of propriety and fear. "Morning coffee," Marcus said, entering the office with 2 steaming mugs and the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there completely. Victor accepted the coffee with a smile that would have been impossible 6 months ago, unguarded, genuine, free from the weight of secrets. "Any interesting overnight reports?" "Senator Williams wants to schedule a meeting about the affordable housing project. The Henderson family doubled their hospital donation, and..." Marcus grinned, settling into the chair across from Victor's desk with the relaxed confidence of an equal rather than an employee. "The Miami Herald wants to do a follow-up article on how Miami's most unexpected love story has affected your business relationships." Victor laughed, the sound echoing freely through the office. "What did you tell them?" "That we're too busy, being happy to analyze it for their readers." The truth was more complex, of course. The weeks following the gala had been a whirlwind of consequences, adjustments, and revelations. Some business associates had distanced themselves, their discomfort with Victor's public authenticity, revealing the shallow nature of relationships he'd mistaken for friendships. But others had surprised him. Senator Williams had called the morning after the gala to express her admiration for his courage. The Henderson family had increased their charitable commitments, saying they were inspired by his willingness to lead with love. 3 major business deals had actually accelerated when potential partners realized they were working with someone who valued integrity over image. Most surprisingly, Isabella had sent a handwritten note 2 months later. Not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement that she'd been trying to marry the man she thought Victor should be, rather than the man he actually was. "Any regrets about leaving private military contracting for this?" Victor asked, gesturing vaguely at their transformed dynamic. Marcus set down his coffee and moved to the window, standing beside Victor as he had countless times before, but now without the careful distance that had once defined their interactions. "You know what I regret?" Marcus said, his voice thoughtful. "I regret that it took me 3 years to realize that protecting you and loving you weren't separate jobs. They were the same job." Victor felt that familiar warmth spread through his chest, the same feeling that had sustained him through the challenging months of rebuilding his life on a foundation of truth rather than pretense. The intercom buzzed, interrupting the moment. "Mr. Castellanos, your 9 o'clock appointment is here," his assistant announced. "Send them in," Victor replied, but this time he didn't move away from the window, didn't assume the formal posture that had once been his armor against the world. The door opened to admit Dr. Sarah Chen, director of the Miami Children's Hospital, carrying a portfolio that Victor suspected contained good news. Her smile was radiant as she approached. "Victor, Marcus, good morning." Dr. Chen had been one of the first people to embrace their relationship, publicly stating that children needed to see examples of authentic love in all its forms. "I have updates on the new wing construction." As they settled into the comfortable seating area near the window, Victor marveled at how naturally Marcus had integrated into these meetings. His security background provided valuable insights into logistics and safety, while his natural intelligence made him a valuable sounding board for strategic decisions. "The construction is ahead of schedule and under budget," Dr. Chen continued, spreading blueprints across the coffee table. But more importantly, we've had 17 major donors come forward since the gala, all citing your courage as inspiration for their own generosity. She looked up from the plans, her expression serious but warm. Victor, what you did that night, choosing authenticity over safety, it rippled outward in ways you probably don't even realize. We've had 3 other prominent couples come out publicly since then, all mentioning your example as giving them permission to stop hiding. Marcus reached over and took Victor's hand, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing, but still sent electricity up Victor's arm every time it happened. The new wing will serve twice as many children as originally planned, Dr. Chen continued. And we're implementing a new program specifically focused on supporting LGBTQ+ youth and their families, funded entirely by donors who were inspired by your story. Victor felt tears prick at his eyes. He'd known intellectually that his public declaration had consequences beyond his personal life, but hearing the concrete impact on vulnerable children made it real in a way that humbled him completely. There's something else, Dr. Chen said, her smile turning mischievous. The kids in the current wing have been asking when Mr. Victor and Mr. Marcus's are coming to visit again. Apparently, you've become quite popular. Their first visit to the hospital had been Marcus's idea, a suggestion that they see firsthand how their courage was making a difference. Victor had expected to offer comfort to sick children, but instead found himself receiving something far more valuable. Acceptance. Without question, love without conditions, joy without judgment. The children had asked direct questions with the honesty that only kids possess. Are you married? Do you live together? Do you love each other? And when Victor and Marcus answered truthfully, the responses had been universally positive. Cool, that's nice. My teacher has 2 dads too. We'll schedule another visit soon, Victor promised, meaning it completely. After Dr. Chen departed, Victor and Marcus returned to the window, watching Miami come alive with another day of possibilities. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't told me about Isabella's plan? Victor asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering. I think about it every day, and every day I'm grateful I chose love over safety. Even though it changed everything, especially because it changed everything. Marcus turned to face him fully. Victor, for 3 years, I watched you build walls around yourself. Professional walls, social walls, emotional walls. You were the most successful man I knew and the loneliest. Victor nodded, remembering the isolation that had defined his life before that night on South Beach. Now look at you, Marcus continued. You're still successful, still powerful, still influential, but you're also happy, you're free, He searched for the right word. Myself, Victor finished quietly. Yourself, Marcus agreed. And that version of you is changing more lives than the hidden version ever could. The truth of that statement was evident in ways both large and small. Victor's businesses were thriving under his more authentic leadership style. His charitable work had expanded beyond mere check writing to active involvement and advocacy. His relationships, the ones that survived his revelation, had deepened into genuine friendships based on mutual respect rather than social utility. Most importantly, he woke up every morning excited about the day ahead rather than dreading the performance required to get through it. There's something I want to ask you, Victor said, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since that night on stage. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his security instincts still sharp enough to detect the change in Victor's tone. Victor reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small velvet box, not unlike the one Isabella had carried to the gala, but chosen with entirely different intentions. Marcus Rivera, Victor said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. You've spent 3 years protecting my life. Will you spend the rest of yours sharing it? The proposal was simple, direct, honest, everything their relationship had become. No grand gestures, no public spectacle, just two people who had found in each other the courage to be completely authentic. Marcus stared at the ring for a moment, a simple platinum band that reflected the morning light streaming through the office windows. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Are you sure you want to bind yourself to your former security consultant for life?" Marcus asked, but his smile made it clear he already knew the answer. "I'm sure I want to bind myself to the man who taught me that love is the greatest security of all," Victor replied. Marcus took the ring from the box and slipped it onto his finger, where it settled as if it had always belonged there. "Then yes," Marcus said simply. "Yes to sharing our lives. Yes to building something new together. Yes to whatever comes next." They kissed then, with Miami spreading out below them and the future stretching ahead like an uncharted ocean. The kiss tasted like coffee and possibility, like courage and coming home. When they broke apart, Victor rested his forehead against Marcus's, marveling at how completely his life had transformed. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked, echoing his question from the gala stage. Victor looked out at the city he'd helped build, at the empire he'd created, at the life he'd finally learned to live authentically. "Now we get back to work," Victor said with a grin. "We have a wedding to plan, a hospital wing to open, and a city full of people who are watching to see what's possible when you choose love over fear." As if summoned by their conversation, the intercom buzzed again with the day's next appointment. The next opportunity to lead by example, the next chance to prove that authenticity wasn't just personally liberating, it was professionally revolutionary. Victor Castellanos had spent decades building an empire based on control and image. Now, 6 months after the night that changed everything, he was discovering that an empire built on truth and love was infinitely more powerful. And as Marcus straightened his tie before their next meeting, a gesture both professional and intimate, Victor realized that the greatest security he'd ever known wasn't found in walls or guards or carefully constructed personas. It was found in the simple, revolutionary act of being completely, authentically, unapologetically himself. Outside their window, South Beach stretched toward the horizon where they'd first declared their love to the world. The waves continued their eternal rhythm, carrying with them the promise that some changes, the ones born of courage and nurtured by truth, are permanent as the tide itself. The Miami magnate had indeed lost control that night 6 months ago, and in losing control, he had found everything that mattered: